The story of the War of the Three Henrys begins like a slow-burning fuse, one that nobody expected to explode with such force, yet every powerful man involved kept lighting it a little more with pride, religion, ambition, and fear. Imagine a kingdom already exhausted from decades of religious conflict, where neighbors eyed each other with suspicion and the throne of France seemed more like a prize in a deadly game than a sacred responsibility. This war did not simply start with armies marching and swords drawn. It began inside royal chambers, behind closed doors, in whispered plots and uneasy alliances. In late 16th century France, three men named Henry stood at the center of this storm. Henry III, the King of France struggling to keep control. Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot leader and heir to the throne whose faith made many fear him. And Henry, Duke of Guise, the powerful Catholic champion whose popularity in Paris sometimes seemed greater than the king's own. Each of them believed that he alone understood what France should become, and each of them had followers ready to fight and die for that belief. The people of France were pulled between loyalty to their faith and fear for their lives as cities divided into Catholic strongholds and Huguenot communities, and rumor traveled faster than armies. It was a time when sermons could spark riots and royal decisions could trigger uprisings overnight. Henry III, the reigning monarch, was a complex figure, intelligent yet indecisive, torn between a desire for peace and a fear of losing power. He had watched his country bleed through the earlier wars of religion and knew that every decision risked another wave of violence. Yet his court was filled with favorites, jealousies, and intrigues, and many nobles doubted his strength. Opposing him stood Henry, Duke of Guise, charismatic, disciplined, publicly devout, and adored by the militant Catholic League that wanted to keep France firmly Catholic at any cost. He was everything the Paris crowds admired: bold in war, confident in politics, and unafraid to challenge the king himself. Then there was Henry of Navarre, born a Protestant, skilled in battle, practical in politics, and ironically the legitimate heir to the French throne because of dynastic law. For many Catholics this was unthinkable, and for many Protestants he represented hope in a time of persecution. The stage was set not only for a clash of armies but for a clash of identities, where religion and royal blood twisted together and made every choice dangerous. Foreign powers watched closely too, with Spain supporting the League and England quietly backing Navarre, turning French soil into the center of a wider struggle for influence in Europe. The opening moments of the conflict felt like a kingdom holding its breath. Violence flickered in provinces, royal edicts tried and failed to calm passions, and each Henry gathered men, weapons, and money in preparation for what increasingly looked inevitable. Ordinary families listened to news brought by travelers and wondered which banner would appear near their town, which faith would become dangerous to profess next week, and whose loyalty would be questioned. Priests preached, ministers argued, and pamphlets spread fear that France might break apart entirely. The king tried to stand above factions but found himself trapped between them, needing Catholic support yet threatened by the immense popularity of the Duke of Guise. At the same time he could not ignore Henry of Navarre, whose claim to the throne was real and whose military talents were proven. Every move risked rebellion, and every compromise angered someone powerful. So the War of the Three Henrys did not simply begin with a clash of steel. It began with hesitation, mistrust, and calculation. It was like watching three great chess players moving pieces across the same board while the board itself was on fire. Each man named Henry believed fate pointed toward him, and each slowly realized that the others would not step aside willingly. As alliances hardened and money flowed to armies, the kingdom edged toward open conflict. The people of France felt the tension in marketplaces, in churches, and at dinner tables, where conversations turned whispered when strangers passed. It was a moment full of suspense because everyone sensed that something enormous was about to break loose, but no one knew who would survive the struggle or what kind of France would emerge from the smoke. As the tension hardened into open conflict, the political games turned into marching boots and the diplomatic whispers transformed into the thunder of cannons, and France slowly slid from uneasy peace into unmistakable war. The War of the Three Henrys took shape not as one single decisive campaign but as a series of blows, responses, betrayals, and sudden reversals in which none of the three Henrys could completely trust their allies or fully read the intentions of their rivals. Henry of Navarre moved first toward open battle, gathering his Huguenot followers, veterans hardened by years of persecution, and nobles who believed that his claim to the throne offered the only real hope for stability. He was practical and ruthless when needed, knowing that sympathy would not win him France, only victory would. Across the country, the Duke of Guise rallied the Catholic League, fanning public fear that a Protestant king would destroy the soul of France and turning religious devotion into political power. His entry into Paris was not merely a military maneuver, it was a triumphal display of influence, banners waving, crowds cheering, priests blessing the soldiers as if they were crusaders rather than subjects rebelling against their king. Meanwhile, Henry III watched this spectacle with growing alarm, knowing that he was still the crowned king yet feeling power slip from his hands every time the League dictated terms to him or ignored his commands completely. The balance of authority was cracking, and the king found himself increasingly isolated, dependent on factions he despised and threatened by favorites he himself had elevated. The war's early campaigns revealed just how divided the kingdom truly was. In 1587, at the Battle of Coutras, the tension erupted into one of the conflict's bloodiest and most decisive engagements. Henry of Navarre, aided by English money and by commanders who understood both cavalry tactics and gunpowder warfare, faced the royal favourite the Duke of Guise, who led troops loyal to Henry III but fueled by League enthusiasm and the belief that God himself marched with them. The battle was fierce, swirling with charges, smoke, and desperate counterattacks, and when the echoes finally faded it was Navarre who stood victorious. Guise was killed, his army shattered, and the message echoed across France that the Huguenot leader was not merely a political claimant but a commander capable of defeating the king's closest supporters in open combat. This victory gave Navarre momentum and legitimacy, yet it also deepened the fear of a Protestant succession among many Catholics, pushing more cities and nobles toward the League. At the same time, in the eastern regions, the Duke of Guise demonstrated his own military strength by defeating the German Protestant forces who had marched into France to join Navarre's cause. At Vimory and Orno he broke their strength with disciplined maneuver and relentless pressure, proving that he could defend Catholic interests not just with speeches in Paris but with victories in the field. The war thus became a terrifying balance, Navarre triumphant in the southwest, Guise dominant in the northeast, and Henry III caught in the middle as the legally crowned but politically shrinking monarch. The king's humiliation deepened with each success of the Duke of Guise. When Guise marched in triumph to Paris in defiance of royal orders, the city erupted in celebration for him rather than for the king, crowds filling the streets and treating him almost like a savior. Henry III was forced to withdraw from his capital, an unthinkable insult for a French monarch, retreating to Chartres while his rival controlled the heart of the realm. Pressured and weakened, the king signed the Edict of Union in 1588, confirming the League's demands, naming Guise Lieutenant General of the kingdom and declaring formally that no heretic could inherit the throne of France. It was a moment that burned inside Henry III, because by that single act he appeared to deny the rights of Henry of Navarre and confess that he himself no longer ruled freely but under the shadow of Guise's power. The war was no longer only between faiths, it had become a deadly struggle over who actually governed France, the crowned king, the charismatic duke, or the distant but legitimate heir. Behind the scenes, fear and anger brewed in the royal court. Henry III felt trapped, insulted, and increasingly desperate. He saw that Guise's popularity threatened not only his authority but his very life, because a king who loses power in such a turbulent age rarely keeps his crown for long. Advisors whispered, loyalties shifted, and the king began to contemplate a step from which there would be no return. All across France the population suffered while these political calculations unfolded. Fields were trampled by armies, villages burned, trade routes became dangerous, and life itself seemed uncertain from one week to the next. Families fled walled towns during sieges or starved inside them when supplies ran out. Soldiers on every side justified brutality as necessary for God or king, and civilians paid the price. The suspense of the war lay not only in who would win but in how much France would lose before it was over. Every victory created new enemies, every defeat deepened hate. Yet the three Henrys pushed forward, convinced that backing down meant oblivion. Henry of Navarre hardened his resolve, Henry of Guise grew more confident, Henry III grew more fearful and more determined, in secret, to break the man who had overshadowed him. The stage was set for betrayal and assassination, for acts that would shock Europe, and for a turning point where politics would once again shape the battlefield just as much as the battlefield shaped politics. The breaking point came not with armies clashing in wide-open fields but with a decision made in the shadows of the royal court, a choice that revealed just how far Henry III was willing to go to reclaim authority that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Humiliated by the power of the Duke of Guise and the dominance of the Catholic League, the king convinced himself that France could not survive with Guise alive and free to command the loyalty of Paris and the League. What began as fear hardened into lethal intention. In the winter of 1588, during a meeting of the Estates General at Blois, Henry III lured the Duke of Guise into a false sense of security, pretending reconciliation while secretly preparing his death. Guise walked into the royal presence confident, certain that the king no longer dared challenge him, and within moments royal guards fell upon him and cut him down. His brother, the Cardinal of Guise, was murdered soon after, and other League leaders were arrested in a sweeping strike that stunned France. This was not a battlefield victory but an act of political violence that echoed like cannon fire. The king had removed his greatest rival, yet in doing so he ignited a new level of fury. Instead of restoring his power, the assassinations turned Guise into a martyr for the League, and crowds in Paris raged with grief and anger, convinced that the king himself had become a tyrant and a traitor to the Catholic cause. The consequences were immediate and explosive. The League refused to be broken by the loss of its most famous leader and instead rallied around a new figure, the Duke of Mayenne, who declared open war on Henry III and mobilized Paris into a fortress of rebellion. Pamphlets, sermons, and speeches portrayed the assassinated Guise as a heroic defender of the faith struck down by a wicked monarch, and the king found that the very capital of his kingdom was now openly hostile to him. Henry III, recognizing that he could not retake Paris alone, made the decision that once seemed impossible. He turned toward the man whom he had earlier been pressured to disinherit, Henry of Navarre. Their alliance was born not from friendship but from necessity and mutual survival. The Catholic king and the Protestant heir joined forces in 1589, each needing the other to defeat the League that threatened both their claims to authority. It was one of the bitter ironies of the war. The monarch who had signed the Edict of Union now marched beside the very heretic it had sought to exclude. Together they advanced toward Paris, and their combined armies began closing in on the League's last stronghold, tightening the ring of siege and signaling that the rebellion might soon be crushed. Yet just as victory seemed near, fate intervened with shocking suddenness. In August 1589, Henry III was assassinated by a fanatic Dominican friar named Jacques Clement, who gained access to the king and stabbed him, claiming divine inspiration for his deed. The wounded king lingered long enough to make one final decision that would shape the future of France. He publicly recognized Henry of Navarre as his legitimate successor and urged him to embrace Catholicism to secure the loyalty of the kingdom. With the king's death, the War of the Three Henrys lost one of its central figures but gained its moment of highest uncertainty. There was now only one Henry left in the struggle, Navarre, yet his path to the throne was anything but clear. The League refused to accept him, Spain threatened intervention, and many Catholic nobles balked at the idea of a Protestant king ruling France. The countryside was exhausted, cities were divided, and the throne itself seemed surrounded not by courtiers but by armies. Henry of Navarre, however, proved himself more than just a skilled general. He became a shrewd statesman who understood the human heart of politics. He fought League forces where necessary, winning key victories, but he also realized that endless war would only tear France apart beyond repair. His famous willingness to convert to Catholicism, summed up in the idea that Paris is worth a mass, was not a betrayal of principle as much as a recognition that unity required sacrifice. By accepting Catholicism, he removed the League's central argument against him and opened the door for reconciliation in a country starving for peace. Slowly, cities that had resisted him began to submit, nobles switched allegiance, and foreign involvement receded. The war that had begun with three Henrys ended with one king who had navigated faith, bloodshed, politics, and assassination to claim the crown as Henry IV of France. The suspense of the conflict did not lie only in battles but in these twists of fortune, assassins changing history in a single moment, allies becoming enemies and then allies again, and a kingdom hovering between collapse and rebirth while its fate rested in the hands of men driven by power, fear, and vision. As the struggle lengthened and the ambitions of great men continued to collide, the true weight of the War of the Three Henrys was measured less in crowns and titles than in the suffering spread across the landscape of France, where villages vanished, cities starved, and entire regions felt as if they had been drained of life by marching armies that treated every road as a path to survival and every farmhouse as a source of supplies. The mid-war period was a time when the romantic images of banners, armor, and glorious charges gave way to the grim reality of mud, hunger, disease, and fear. Soldiers from every faction, League militias, royal troops, German and Swiss mercenaries, Huguenot cavalry, moved through the countryside taking grain, seizing livestock, burning storehouses when resistance appeared, and leaving families staring at empty fields that would not yield food for the coming winter. Towns that declared for the League risked being besieged by royalists. Towns that welcomed Navarre risked retaliation from Catholic forces. Neutrality was almost impossible, because every army suspected betrayal and demanded loyalty at the point of a pike. Trade routes that once connected prosperous markets now carried only rumors and wounded men, and the great rivers became lines of division instead of arteries of commerce. In some regions, churches stood abandoned, their bells silent, while in others they rang constantly, calling people to prayer in the hope that God might finally end the violence that human leaders seemed determined to prolong. The financial cost was just as destructive as the physical one. Kings and dukes borrowed heavily, pledged revenues they did not yet have, and minted coinage that lost value as quickly as trust evaporated between factions. Taxes grew harsher, collection became more brutal, and peasants who had nothing left to give were beaten or driven from their land. Famine and disease traveled in the wake of armies, and entire villages disappeared from records, swallowed by the chaos of war. In besieged cities, bread was rationed, horses were eaten, and desperate deals were made in the darkness between defenders and besiegers alike. Paris, which had once celebrated the Duke of Guise as a hero, later felt the weight of shortages and political tension as League leaders tried to hold it against royalist and Navarrese pressure, and ordinary citizens discovered that enthusiasm for a cause could not fill empty stomachs. The psychological toll was immense. Children grew up hearing more about massacres than markets. Parents wondered whether allegiance to the wrong side might cost their families their lives, and clergy on both sides preached fiery sermons that mixed faith with vengeance until it became difficult to tell where religion ended and politics began. Suspicion became a daily companion, and the map of France looked less like a unified kingdom than a patchwork of fortified towns, shifting loyalties, and scarred battlefields. Militarily, the middle phase of the conflict showed how war in the late 16th century had evolved into a brutal combination of pike formations, arquebus fire, artillery bombardment, cavalry shock, and the slow strangulation of siege warfare. Commanders learned to adapt, to dig trenches, to construct earthworks, and to batter stone walls with increasingly powerful guns that turned medieval defenses into rubble. For soldiers, survival depended on discipline, luck, and the willingness to do terrible things under orders. For civilians trapped behind city walls, survival meant enduring shelling, fire, disease, and the agonizing choice of surrender or starvation. Each major confrontation left thousands dead or maimed, and each victory was shadowed by reprisals. The numbers of dead were not just statistics. They were missing farmers, vanished merchants, silent homes, and overgrown fields that once had been cultivated by hands that now lay buried in mass graves. France was bleeding from within, and the three Henrys, Guise dead, Henry III assassinated, Navarre still fighting, left behind not only political drama but a landscape marked by smoke, ruined harvests, and widows who could no longer remember the last year that had passed without war. Yet even amid this devastation, the suspense of the conflict deepened rather than faded, because the question had shifted from who would win to whether France itself could survive the endless cycle of battle and revenge. Henry of Navarre's campaigns after the death of Henry III showed both determination and exhaustion, as his forces struggled to secure cities that hesitated to accept a Protestant king and League strongholds clung stubbornly to resistance despite the clear strategic disadvantage. Foreign powers continued to hover, Spain lending support to the League, England offering money to Navarre, and Europe watching a kingdom that once had been a pillar of continental power now staggering under the weight of internal hatred. Every negotiation seemed to open the door to betrayal, and every treaty was treated with suspicion before the ink had dried. Still, slowly and painfully, Navarre's combination of military pressure and political flexibility began to reshape the situation. His willingness to compromise, to convert for the sake of unity, and to offer the prospect of tolerance hinted at the possibility that France might finally step back from the abyss. But at that moment in the war, nothing was guaranteed. The population was exhausted, armies were frayed, and leaders understood that one more assassination, one more disastrous battle, or one more foreign intervention could plunge the kingdom into complete collapse. It was a time when the fate of France balanced on decisions made by weary commanders and calculating politicians, and the people waited anxiously to see whether the smoke would finally clear or whether the flames would rise yet again. As the smoke of years of conflict slowly began to lift, the final act of the War of the Three Henrys did not arrive with a single dramatic clash, but rather with a gradual realization across France that endless bloodshed could no longer answer the questions that had torn the kingdom apart. Henry of Navarre, hardened by campaigns, sieges, victories, and setbacks, emerged as the last surviving Henry, carrying both the burden of past violence and the fragile hope of national unity. His decision to convert to Catholicism, whether seen as political calculation or genuine spiritual choice, broke the central argument of the Catholic League and allowed exhausted cities to open their gates without feeling they were betraying their faith. One by one, provinces accepted him, noble families that had fought against him sought reconciliation, and the roar of artillery gave way to the quieter work of rebuilding fields, reopening markets, and restoring order on roads once stalked by soldiers. When he was crowned Henry IV, he did not inherit a peaceful, prosperous realm. He inherited a wounded country full of destroyed villages, traumatized families, and a treasury nearly empty from decades of conflict. Yet he also inherited the possibility of healing, and that possibility was something France had lacked for an entire generation. Under Henry IV, the long-term consequences of the war became clear. The monarchy had been shaken, religion had been weaponized, and assassination had proven strong enough to topple kings and alter the course of history in a single night. The memory of the three Henrys lingered. Henry III, tragic and indecisive, destroyed by the conflict he could not control. Henry of Guise, charismatic and uncompromising, whose death turned him into a symbol of Catholic militancy. And Henry of Navarre, survivor and strategist, who learned to trade stubbornness for pragmatism and transformed from Protestant challenger into Catholic king. The Edict of Nantes, issued later by Henry IV, embodied the lessons of this cruel era by granting limited toleration to the Huguenots while maintaining the Catholic identity of the kingdom, seeking a middle ground that earlier rulers had refused to accept. It did not end all tension, nor erase hatred, but it offered something revolutionary for its time, the idea that a state could survive even when not all its citizens shared the same faith. The war had proven the cost of intolerance in burned towns and unmarked graves, and the edict represented the first serious attempt to ensure that France would not again be consumed so easily by religious civil war. The human stories carried forward longest. Survivors remembered the years when choosing the wrong side at the wrong moment could mean execution, when rumors of marching troops emptied whole neighborhoods before dawn, and when prayers were whispered not only for salvation but for food. Generations grew up with scars both visible and invisible, and the landscape itself bore the reminders. Rebuilt churches where the old ones had burned, new walls rising on the ruins of old fortifications, cemeteries expanded beyond anything people had imagined before the wars began. The suspense that had once surrounded which Henry would win gradually transformed into a quieter question about whether France would ever again allow fanaticism to push it so close to self-destruction. Diplomats, writers, and ordinary citizens reflected on how swiftly politics could turn to violence and how hard it was to return to normal life once hatred had been unleashed. Europe, too, took note, recognizing that France's internal struggle had been more than a domestic conflict. It had been a stage on which Spain, England, and the German states tested their influence, showing how deeply religious wars could warp international politics. Looking back, the War of the Three Henrys stands as one of the most intense chapters in French history because it combined palace intrigue, battlefield heroism, betrayal, fanaticism, and statesmanship in a single turbulent story that reshaped a nation. It showed that kings could fall not only to armies but to isolated assassins, that popular leaders could become too powerful for monarchs to tolerate, and that the rightful heir could be rejected simply because of his faith until he chose conversion for the sake of peace. The war's beginning was full of tension and ambition, its middle full of devastation and suspense, and its end full of fragile hope resting on the shoulders of one man who had already spent half his life fighting to survive. Henry IV's reign did not erase the past, but it gave France enough stability to move forward, to rebuild cities, to restore royal authority, and to gradually mend divisions that had nearly torn the kingdom apart forever. And now, as you have followed this journey through ambition, assassination, religious passion, and the struggle for a nation's soul, I invite you to stay with us as we continue exploring the great battles and turning points that shaped world history. If you feel that our videos are giving you accurate knowledge and helping you understand the real stories behind these events, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and press the bell notification button so you can watch our latest episodes in this ongoing war series as soon as they are released. Your support keeps this historical journey alive and brings more untold stories from the past straight to you.